You are not a bank. And all it takes is one bad client who you complete work on the property, and then they decide that they are going to do something else with it, and now you have this bill. And we have seen it. We've seen it. Every single client we've worked with who did not do that implemented a policy later to collect funds earlier on because they got burned. And I can promise you, and I have a feeling you see this as well, you don't lose properties for requesting funds for work you're getting completed. Hi, I'm Candace.
And I'm Kristen, and welcome to the Path Building Podcast. In today's episode, we are going to be jumping into the make ready process. And Candace, I'm really excited to talk to you about this one because I think you have some hot takes. You've got some best practices. And so let's jump into it.
I am very excited to talk about make ready. Make ready is one of those processes that I feel is borderline overlooked because it happens.
Just borderline?
Borderline, no, just a little bit. It is a very important part of the process, but it also is squeezed between two of the most important parts of managing a property, which is bringing on a new owner and then leasing a property, right? So you have these two kind of capstones in your property management business, and this falls between the two, but you really cannot do either without this process intertwining with it.
And so to kick us off, my first question here, Candace, is what is a make ready? Can you just baseline to make sure that we are all on the same page, whether you're a seasoned pro, brand new property manager? What is make ready, Candace? What does that actually mean?
Absolutely. I mean, we have so many words for make ready. We've got make ready. Some companies call them turns, some call them flips. But functionally what we're talking about is the process of getting a property from not ready for a resident to move in to ready for a resident to move in. It's that period that we are getting the property cleaned and up to our standards and getting the work completed. A lot of people, when they're looking at a make ready or a turn or a flip, we're looking at two different ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
One is when a resident's moved out of a property and then you're getting it ready for another resident while concurrently doing a security deposit disposition. That's not the one I'm talking about.
No,
today.
Not at all?
No, I mean, smidget.
Throw it out the window.
Not today.
Not today, Candace.
Today, we are talking about, we brought on a new owner, they handed us a property, and now we need to get it ready for residents. Potentially, it's never had renters before. Potentially, it has. Maybe they just bought the property and they've never even stepped foot into it. But our job is now to go in and get this property ready for a resident.
Makes total sense to me. So now that we know what that is, I think the best place to start is a lot of times with policy. Because whenever we're looking at this make ready, some companies have some very firm policies around what they will allow owners to do, what they won't allow owners to do. And so my question to you is, how does a company come about deciding if they should let an owner do work on the property? Is the company going to handle it? How do you start to make decisions around that piece there?
That's a very good question. So the big question you're asking is, should we allow our owners to come in and do the make ready?
That is the question.
No.
Oh,
I'm just kidding.
No.
So really, when we think about the policy with owners completing a make ready, you have to think about what your company's infrastructure is set up for. Do we have the team capacity to make sure that it's up to the standards? Do we have the vendors to even handle all of our make readies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's some companies, their owners have to be able to contribute to completing a make ready because their team just simply does not have capacity. We have other companies where the owners, the second that they give us keys and they say, hey, you're managing my property, they're not allowed to step foot in it again, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it really depends on the company. I do see a lot of frustration when we're looking at teams and getting work done, when the owner is completing a make ready versus us doing it internally. But again, it's all up to infrastructure and what you're capable of doing.
And so whenever we're looking at property standards, I think that that's something that really plays a piece into here, because something that I experienced as a BDM is I don't think that I was all the way clued into the property standards that we needed, or I was really wanting to sign a deal, so didn't really care about how the property looked. So then whenever it's coming over into our operations, it's causing a lot of hiccups here, right? Because maybe the property standards aren't agreed upon all the way across the company or communicated. So how do we start to determine, I may even be taking us back here, but how do we start to determine for how we want a property to be in our rent ready standards? How do we get to that place of just what we want to see within the property?
I think that it's really good to just look at what the expectations are. What are the legal expectations we have within our market? Some markets are going to have very strict terms. You have to have blinds covering every window. You have to have brand new locks. Some are going to be a lot more relaxed, right? So first look at your local legislation and then zoom in on what do we want our internal standards to be. those really should be established earlier on. You mentioned sometimes like you don't even know. I know I was closed and I'm trying to
Right.
get that money.
To where I was like, who cares if the walls are purple? I don't care.
But my commission,
My commission care. Exactly.
I think that there has to be a really good conversation with the team and have a really good understanding with your BDM that this is the expectation we have. And also find a way to incentivize your BDMs to bring on the properties you want to bring on. So when we're looking high level at our standards, they need to be established very early on. And if you're a business that doesn't have firm written standards, it's not too late to start, right? This is something that you should focus on sooner rather than later. Incorporate your property management team, talk about where there's pain, and then bring on your business development manager and say, hey, these are the expectations. Maybe if we get properties that are there, they're meeting all those standards, they get a little commission bump, right? It's incentivizing them to bring on properties that we want. But I do think it's very important to have it in writing and have the whole entire team trained on what the expectations are for our properties. I'm talking from ground up. So our maintenance team, our leasing team, everyone should know what our expectations are for move-in whenever we're getting property ready.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really good. In this last week, we've been at a conference, and it's at
Not a conference, the
the
conference.
conference, and it's here in Colorado Springs at the Broadmoor, which is a 5-star hotel, the first 5-star hotel. And you said something as we went in that has just kind of been playing in my mind that I think speaks to what you're saying now is we would go up and we would drive to their front gate and you would have to stop. And you asked a question, you said, hey, we're here for a conference. And immediately that person knew exactly where we needed to go. And you said offhandedly, I don't even know if you remember this, but you said, you know that this is a fancy hotel or a really nice hotel whenever everyone knows what is going on. And I think that that speaks to then within your property management company, when you can go to anyone in your company and ask them, what are our make ready standards or what are our property ready standards? And everyone can tell you back, your company is now running at a more efficient level because everyone knows what we're looking for and what we're expecting.
Absolutely. And I think that's so important whenever we're looking. And I do remember saying that because I feel like it stands out. You don't always go places and everyone knows what's happening. We've all been at a hotel where we're like, oh, do you know where we're supposed to go? And they're like, no.
I didn't even know we had a conference here.
Exactly. We've all experienced that. So whenever you go somewhere and the person who is checking you in at the gate is telling you which room you're supposed to go into, that's a very big deal. And now imagine that owner experience whenever the first person that steps foot at the property is telling you the exact same work you need to do that your property manager is telling you. And then you have a leasing agent that comes and says, hey, I saw you completed this work. It really amplifies that experience. And I think a book that we did really early on in our book club was Unreasonable Hospitality.
Yes.
And that is that unreasonable hospitality experience of, oh my gosh, everyone knows what's happening. We're all in sync. And now the owner is having an elevated experience where they're not suddenly getting more and more information where a BDM goes in and says, oh, you have such a beautiful property. Everything's perfect.
And it's not.
And then the property manager comes in and says, that paint needs to be changed. This carpet needs to be replaced. As an owner, that's a very jarring experience.
Absolutely.
And that's why if we're very in sync as a team, it doesn't mean we have to be unkind about it, but we can establish expectations very, very early on.
Absolutely. So I think where I want to start to pivot to now is in these two scenarios and really how do we build a process around them? So let's start with maybe the more difficult one, which would be allowing the owners to step back in and do work on the property. Because at this point, we have onboarded the property, we've gone through, we've walked through it, we've determined the work that needs to be done. How do you do this, Candace? How do you go to the owner, set expectations? What does that look like?
So I think first and foremost, have everything in writing and have the owner sign off on the work that they need to complete. If you're allowing an owner to come in and complete work at the property, they should be expected to have the same standards that our team's going to. And I think regardless, there needs to be a delineation of whenever they are no longer within this process, right? So you establish a time that the work's going to be completed. You have them sign off saying that they understand the liability of using their own vendors and they're expected to have the same standards that we are going to have internally. From there, you're able to give them a little bit of freedom, complete the work. But I'm a very big fan of upon completion of the work, complete an inspection, make sure it's up to our standards, and then be able to provide that documentation back to the owner. So it's all about clear communication. If the owner is involved, make sure that they know what they're expected to do and make sure you know when you're stepping back in.
And so how often should you be following up with the owner in this process? Like, are you telling the owner this work should be done in 3 weeks, 2 weeks? And if yes, no, second question is, How are you following up with the owners throughout this process?
So I think it's all going to depend on your relationship with the owner and the owner's expectations. If this is a property that they're gutting it and they're completely rebuilding it internally, then you're gonna have a longer turnaround. That's up for you to determine, are we onboarding this owner now, or are we going to ask them to come back to us when the property is ready? I know a lot of companies want that agreement signed early, right?
Right.
They want the commitment, and they're like, oh yeah, you can still sign up today, and we'll just, in 4 weeks when it's ready, we'll come back in. So that's going to be up to the company policy and the team's capacity. But I think this is a really good way where you build in some automation in whatever software you're using, enter in the date that the owner said the work's completed, have a few automated follow-ups checking in every couple of weeks and then a day or two before asking if they're on track. I like good communication. I like checking in and seeing if their vendors are up to their standards and if there's anywhere we can support. But you can be really as hands-off or hands-on as you want in this process. It's just up to what your team has capacity for and what your expectations are for the owner in their communication.
Absolutely. And so you recommended then a secondary inspection once the work is completed there with the owner. Now, who is doing that typically, the inspection? And then what happens if it's not where you need it to be and it still looks like garbage?
Yep. So that I think is going to be either the property manager, the onboarding specialist, the person who is going to be responsible from taking it to that point and getting work fixed if it needs to be done later. And so I also think a really good income opportunity where the owner says, hey, I'm going to complete my own work. And you say, I totally understand, but that means we need to do our job twice. And we basically have to do a pre-inspection and we have to charge for that. If you're not wanting to charge, I get it. It's totally up to what the company and the market demand.
You should charge for that.
You should charge for that. But now when we're looking at completing that inspection, if the work's not up to standards, that's where you need a really clear delineation, right? Maybe you're telling the owner, hey, you complete your work at the property, but we are hands off until you're done.
Right.
This is my favorite form of policy if an owner is completed and make ready, is saying that the second that you are handing it to us and telling us the work is done, you are now also giving us permission to fix things that need to be fixed. If it's not up to our standards, we are now taking the reins here and completing any work that needs to be done. And that then you walk in, you see that some work is up to our standard, and now you're going in and saying, hey, owner, you can send out your vendor, but otherwise we're going to get our vendors out and we're taking the reins from here. And that tends to be a really fair delineation, so long as you talk about it in advance. If you're springing that on the owner, that's not going to go well. This should be set as an expectation in the very beginning.
I agree. I think that that's something that, as we go through and we're training salespeople and BDMs, that's a conversation that should be brought up in the sales process there to make sure those expectations are set. I think it should be reminded to them a couple of times. I'm curious your thoughts on that. But I think that if the BDM is out conversing with the owner and they're saying, yeah, I want to do my own work, that is the trigger for the BDM to say, okay, here's the process for that. And they're walking them through. Then once they get signed on, that's communicated over to the team. Once the team has it, then they are re-communicating that with what you said, a form, or you're having the conversation, having them sign off. And when you say sign off, do you mean technically like on a form that they're signing off that they understand, or a conversation?
I like it in writing. So we talked a little bit on our onboarding episode about how to get an onboarding form. So something an owner is completing where they are checking, I understand with our policies. In this instance, that's a great area for us to have a separate form that is literally just an owner is doing the work form, right? And so that form is being completed, and on it, it's saying, we expect your vendors to complete work up to our standards. And then at that point, they're saying, I understand that the work has to be up to the standards, right? But I agree. I think the BDM needs to be very in sync with this work because, again, we do not want to set expectations to an owner that are not going to be fulfilled throughout the remainder of their experience with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else there on the owners doing their own work from Make Ready that you want to make sure that everyone knows? Any other thoughts you have on that? That's it.
I think it's really important just to understand that those are the vendors that they're using are also licensed, insured. Of course, some owners are going to have their handyman, but I think for work that could potentially be a liability to a management company, there does need to be boundaries. And I recently wrote an article about this. And one expectation that I see a lot with management companies is like, the owner is hiring us so they can do whatever they want with their property. That is not a fair assessment, right? You are the owner of the company, or you are someone working for a management company, and you are the person who's deciding the people you want to work with.
Right.
You can go up to an owner and say, no, you cannot use your vendors, and that owner doesn't have to work with you. And maybe that isn't the owner you want working with you. It is your policies. Yes, it's the owner's property, but it is your company's policies and you can say no to business. I know
Yeah.
that can
Oh my gosh, you want me to say no to money?
right? But there's pain-free money and there's painful money.
Right.
And if it's causing us a lot of pain, maybe that's not the money we want to receive. And I'm curious, you've worked with a lot of business development managers. What pushback do you see with business development managers in setting those expectations earlier? Do you think that that's something easily built into their process?
It can be if the training is done correctly, because I think that a lot of times, depending on the expectations that are set on the BDMs, it is hard to say no to the deals. It is hard whenever you have an owner, it's all working out. I'm behind by 10 deals this month. I need a close. I'm going to push them over that I probably should have said no to. So it really depends on the training and how much they understand that, or they understand the client life cycle. I really see that as the point of differentiation between a BDM who's bringing on good properties and a BDM who's bringing on any property. All of the absolute mess whenever bringing on a property that's not up to standards. It is a very, it's understanding that you're able to give to them.
Absolutely. And do you think that there's no property and how do you identify desirable properties, even though maybe easier make calls than hit desirable properties?
I think that 100% sales, everyone has brought on a bad door. Owners, whoever's sitting in that seat initially has, I think there is no way to study, and they are listening to what they're doing. They're going out, they are learning what they are doing every single day. So then they can hear them be frustrated at an owner or at a property or at a resident and understand why. And so then once they can see it firsthand, that's more, I found that to be more beneficial for our sales team coming in to be able to have that empathy for what it is they're doing because they've now seen it. They've been exposed. I do that. Make this person's life really, really terrible. So I think just exposure how the company is running as a whole can go a long understanding and bringing on better. Nobody's going to be perfect. There's going to be secret craziness.
Kristen, not an owner. May not be the owner that is the ideal. Whose responsibility is it to let that the owner? Who's the one who should be having that? Hey, these are
Okay, so at this point in the process, we are at the make ready stage.
we've at least initiated onboarding. We're
Mhm.
partially through.
There's been a handoff. Has there been a handoff between the? There's going to depend. Helpful to bring back in almost as resorts there because in my opinion, I think that we want to make sure that we it is the person who is in charge of this owner and of this property moving forward. So if that's a property manager, that's a client care or at client success, however you call them, right? Whoever is going to be ultimately responsible for the longevity of this relationship should be the one as the first point of contact there. And then if we're looking at escalation, it would go to whoever is above that person and above that person because what the precedent I don't want to set there is, oh, something's going wrong. The BDM comes back in, the BDM fixes it, they step out. That almost like it didn't empower this person. It took away their power and their authority with the owner. So I think that if something is going wrong there and the BDM does need to step back in because they know them, I don't know, for whatever reason they can't. Whoever is ultimately responsible for the longevity of this relationship handles the conflict, handles the thing. If that whoever needs to fire them. But in my opinion, I don't know that the BDM needs to step back into that. What do you think?
I agree. And I think it's also who's the person who's running that relationship.
Right.
I've been the BDM where it's like, you need to come talk to this owner because you didn't set expectations well enough. And in that case, I may not have, right?
Right.
But it's also, it can be a very difficult conversation where you're like, hi, Joe, I haven't talked to you in 2 months.
Exactly.
You can tell you we don't want to work with you anymore.
Right.
I will say some of the most successful firings or even potential firings that we were then able to save occurred on a 3-way call with the owner.
Yeah.
Where the BDM's there and the BDM's able to say, hey, remember we had
Sure.
this conversation. The property manager or the onboarding specialist is there and saying, hey, this is the pushback we're getting, and having that candid conversation with the owner. But I also can see where that can end up a burden on the BDM's time if their job, again, is to come in and try to solve the problems, because where does that line end?
Absolutely. And so I think that something interesting there is just making sure that all of those expectations are communicated, because if the BDM, right, first of all, I think that I don't think that you ever did not communicate property standards. I just want to make sure that that is said. I don't think that you ever did not communicate it. The owner did not hear it. No. So what that means there is where I would have recommended is, it's not your fault, right? It is re-communicating those standards again. And then also then looking back at the sales process and our onboarding process, how often did we re-communicate back to the owner that these are our expectations? Because it does not just fall back on the BDM. It's actually your process that is not working well, because whether the BDM said it verbatim, the property manager said it, if the owner is still not getting it, that means that they don't need to be told something. Maybe they need to be emailed something. Maybe they need to be texted something. Maybe they need to be shown a graphic. We are not communicating with them in a way that they're receiving that information. So it doesn't matter who tells them, right? It matters how can they ensure that they're actually taking this information in. And so then if that's constantly happening where your BDM is having to step back in, you need to look at your process, because there's a break somewhere between what the BDM is communicating and what the owner is hearing. And so that's what would be my recommendation is look at the process. Something is not happening correctly there within process.
And one of the questions we ask in the very beginning when we're creating owner onboarding forms is, what questions can you answer on this form that you're continuously being asked,
yes.
right? Or in your onboarding call. We have set up forms where we have a section saying, hey, you need to add us as additional insured and we need this amount. And they have to say, I understand.
Right.
And maybe they don't read that. Maybe they are on autopilot and they're going click, 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 click. But you know what happens when they're saying, I wasn't told that.
Oh, here's a copy.
Here's a copy of the form you submitted saying
right.
you understand. And so it does alleviate that pressure a little bit. And this is a great opportunity where if an owner is onboarding, whether we're doing the work or not, having written expectations where they're just saying, I understand.
Right.
And you don't give them an option to say, I don't understand. You have an option that says, I understand, or I have questions.
Right.
And then you're able to then open that dialogue and say, okay, I understand you have questions. What are the questions you have about our standards? And now you're able to continue that conversation. But I do agree. I think a lot of the time that pain happens because there is a misunderstanding or information is being lost
right.
in translation. And the owner is not fully understanding the expectations we're trying to set.
Absolutely. And I think that it's really important to ensure that my favorite thing is I'm a big, big advocate for call recording. I think that every call should be recorded. Every Zoom call that you do, Google Meet call, whatever you're doing, everything should be recorded, not to throw it back in the owner's face, but for us to go back and double check, because if we are being told by somebody, the BDM never said that, we can go back and say, no, Kandise, you did do this, you did this right. Like now we have a way to actually review our process to where if we're being told 10 times that one person on our team is not saying something, and then we go back and we listen and they did say it, okay, now we know that the process is the problem, not the person, right? So if we can record everything, we can go back and have data to be able to figure out what's missing, what can we add in, how can we make sure that we can get people to understand what we're saying? Because the method we're communicating is obviously just not working well.
Absolutely. And I do think, and I know I have fallen victim to this, whenever I would do owner onboarding calls, I would end up in just a cadence, right? You do it so many times that, the things people pay attention to, the people to ask questions about, and there's things where you're like, they never ask questions about this, so I'm going to glaze over that.
Right.
And that can end up being a folly to someone who's onboarding an owner. And maybe they glaze over the thing that every single other owner didn't care about. They're in this cadence. And now this one owner is like, you never verbally said this to me. And I think that's also very important that you have that secondary where you can go back and say, okay, why did I miss this? Why was this skipped? and then you can retrain yourself, because we're all going to get comfortable in our role.
Absolutely.
And we're all going to get used to doing things, and it's going to end up a mundane thing we're trying to get through. And so sometimes we need to take that step back or look at that bird's eye view and see, okay, this is something I need to correct to be able to make the process run a lot smoother.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have now gone over owners doing their own work, which has taken us a fair bit of time to get through because there's a complexity there. And I think that, just to add a little bit more here, I think that there's two options here for owners doing their own work, where we will sign the PMA and we will get them onboarded and then hand it back to them to be able, essentially, right, hand it back to them so that they can complete the work. Yeah. They complete it, then we bring it back and then go into leasing. Or the other policy to that is, great, get it all fixed, and then we will sign the management agreement there. In which case, do we still do make ready? So let's say, now we're going to go into this us doing the work. I think that's where it's going to lead us. We say, all right, owner, yes, go ahead. You need to fix the paint. You need to fix the floor. You need to do this. We need it all to a neutral color. Here's our standards, print it out. The owner goes and does that. We're bringing it on now. Do we still pop into make ready?
So the way I think about that is, I don't know that we necessarily need to wait to sign the management agreement.
Okay.
We can still sign the management agreement,
Sure.
but we can have the date set for the date they expect the work to be completed, right? So agreement signed, you told us the work's going to take you 2 weeks to complete. In 2 weeks, we are going to come and meet you, and we're going to get keys, and we're walking through the property.
And that triggers onboarding, or I'm sorry.
Oh no, onboarding I think is running concurrent.
Okay, got it.
So you're still doing your onboarding process, but you're kind of pausing at the point that you would be collecting keys and going into the property and completing the work. I do think there's really two ways you can go about it. Some people have a trigger, and I'm going to speak of this as a task management mind frame because I think it's a little easier to visualize. So we are in our onboarding process. I'm just imagining there's like right here an onboarding process, right?
So if you're just listening to this, make sure you pop over to YouTube to watch Kandise walk you through it with her hands.
Yes, with no visuals,
just
my hands.
Just the hands.
So we have our onboarding process. And you can be in that onboarding process where you're having two like areas where the tree splits, right? And so right here is, does the property need work? Yes, no. If you say yes, boom, and make ready. If you say no, boom, marketing, right? So that is a way to do it. Some companies have it where you go from onboarding and you always go straight to the make ready box. In the make ready box, you're saying, does the property need work? Yes,
right.
no. And you're still completing your inspection in that make ready process. So it's a lot easier to conceptualize when you're using a software that requires you to make the decision. When you're talking internal policy, I think it's good to have visuals. I think it's good for the team to be able to see our life cycle and see where the client's going and why we're moving there, even if it's not a task management software. So whenever I think of my ideal process, it's that we've onboarded an owner, we've signed the agreement, we have the established date of when we expect the property is going to be ready for work to be completed. Or the owner said, you know, my cousin Jones, a really great handyman, he's going to be done in 3 days. We're meeting them in 3 days and we're walking through the property. If the property is not up to our standards, we're saying, hey, owner, this is the work we're now going to have to complete. We are now taking the property from this point. If the owner pushes back and says, no, I'm going to get him back, that's when we have to have the conversation with the owner where we're saying, you know, we understand, but at this point, maybe you're not the best fit for us.
Sure.
You know? And so I think that having that really firm delineation of this is the moment where everything that happens after this point, we are going to run on your behalf is a really good expectation to establish very early on. Then from that point, we walk through the property, and if it is perfect, fantastic. Joe did a great job. Wonderful. But if not, then at that point, we're getting our vendors in and we're able to then facilitate our process. And there's no breaks in it. It's going to be a lot easier for our team to manage.
That makes total sense. So then popping over to our scenario B here, where we don't let owners do any work. They have to give us the keys. And once they give us the keys, we're taking that on from there. And we are going to complete everything for the property. What does that look like, Kandise? Like at a high level, get into detail, however you want to explain it. What does that look like?
I mean, conceptually, fantastic. The BDM meets the owner of the property and says, actually, owner, I need you to step out the door because this is my property now and all of the work is mine, right? And conceptually, the owner's like, fantastic, wonderful, do all the work. I'll sign the agreement while I drive away. That's never going to happen. So I think there's no world where the owner just never has the option to do work because they can say, hey, I'm not going to sign the agreement until I complete the work at the property. I think that is the best case scenario where you just say, at this point, this is the delineation, and that is when the owner is not completing work.
Right.
If they already have the work scheduled to be completed, fantastic, but that means we're not coming in until that work's completed. So I think that's going to always be the kickoff. We're going to have the owners that say, hey, I don't have time to manage this. I want you to take it from the front. Perfect. Those are really our ideal clients, right? But regardless, as long as we have a firm line
Right.
that from this point forward, we are now responsible, that's going to make it a lot easier on the team.
Perfect. I agree with you. So whenever, no, that was for everyone else. Stop letting your owners do the work.
Yeah.
But once, okay, so we go into the property, right? So owner says, yep, our policy is we're going to do all of the work. We, the management company. Owner gives us keys. We go through, we walk the property, we make a punch list, I'm assuming, of the stuff that has to happen. What happens next? Like how, like really step by step, what are we wanting to do here to get this property from where it is that the owner handed it over to us to it's ready for a tenant to move in?
So I think that's going to depend on who you want to be responsible for communicating that information to the owner. I think it's always very valuable for a BDM to come in and be able to know high level what work needs to be done. There's never going to be
100%.
And I think your team should be pretty knowledgeable of the cost of work. And I know that's going to be something that not all BDMs have time to sit with vendors and learn what the cost of things are. But we built sheets for companies that have estimated costs based on square foot. So based on square footage, this is the average amount it's going to cost us hourly to complete painting, and cleaning is this much per hour. So for your square footage, it's about this. And I think that's a really valuable resource for our BDMs to have. So we can say, it's probably going to cost you about $1,500, give or take. It could be more.
Right.
But this is what our expectation is for getting this property ready. And then you have potentially your property manager or your onboarding specialist sitting in on the owner onboarding call, or at least communicating with that owner immediately after the point that deal's closed, saying, hey, I'm so glad that you've decided to sign on with us. I'm going to be your point of contact going forward. Just to recap, this is what I learned that we're doing at the property. If you have questions about the work that's being completed, do you have any issues with us scheduling to get those estimates and that work completed? And having that conversation really before we're doing much else.
Right. Okay, so we're having the conversation. They say, yep, that sounds good. Do we already have estimates at this point, or is this conversation before we've booked anything out and we have any firm costs there?
I mean, that is so company contingent.
Sure.
We've talked to owners that are like, we're never going to get an estimate or make ready. We're not putting our vendors on that property until
Exactly.
they're completing the work.
Sure.
So I think it's going to be dependent on what our capacity is with our vendors. Do we have vendors that are cool with going out a couple times and getting estimates? A lot of companies don't have that. And especially right now, it's just so expensive to even get from one place to another. Vendors don't want to do it. So I think it's worth having something verbally said, even if it is just the kind of average estimate. And then at that point, if it is really large work, maybe we are getting someone in to give us an exact quote. We're also dependent on the owner's needs and what we're willing to do.
Sure.
But that's all going to be based on the company and who that ideal client is.
Okay. So then let's say owner says, yep, that's all good. Go ahead, get it all done. Are we collecting payment? Like, should we collect any form of payment from the owner at this point? Is their reserve going to be enough to cover it? How do we go about that? Or do we 50% up front? I've heard it all, but I'm curious what you think. I know we try to give it depends answers, but I think give the it depends, but I think give like what you think best practice should be in this.
Not an it depends.
Okay, all right. Oh, hot take.
Bankroll your client's turns. You are not a bank. You are not a bank. And all it takes is one bad client who you complete work on the property, and then they decide that they are going to do something else with it, and now you have this bill. And we have seen it. We've seen it. Every single client we've worked with who did not do that implemented a policy later to collect funds earlier on because they got burned. And I can promise you, and I have a feeling you see this as well, you don't lose properties for requesting funds for work you're getting completed. And if you're losing an owner is sitting across from you and they're saying, I'm not giving you money for the work you're doing at my property, you should be getting up and leaving that house, right?
Yeah.
Like, there is no reason to bring on an owner who cannot afford to give you the funding for the work that's needed at their property, or you need to reestablish your expectations with owners.
Absolutely. So I think that some of that then goes back to in the sales process. I think that having your salesperson not have those crucial conversations is a disservice to your owners.
Oh, wow.
I hear a lot of times, my salesperson doesn't need to do that. My BDM doesn't need to do that. They don't need to know that. I have a strong disagreement with that they need to, because if you know on average in your city that your turns cost anywhere between $6,000 to $10,000, that is just what they cost for a baseline turn. your BDM needs to be communicating that up front, because if your owner does not have the financial stamina, they should not be coming on board, because the times that you do lose clients whenever you're asking for funds is because they don't have it. And if they don't have it, they should not be renting out a property with you.
What happens when there's a vacancy? What happens when the market slows and they now can't afford their mortgage?
What happens whenever something that is mandatory to happen, right, in the state of Texas, and I'm sure it is in Arizona, if it gets above 100 degrees, you have to have some form of AC in that property.
85 in Arizona,
Oh,
right?
wow. In Texas, they're like, no, burn.
You'll have to
But
be on fire before the AC.
exactly. But it's that every single day in the summer. And so you're getting these warning signs up front now before we've done really anything in the property, and you're asking them for money and they're saying, no, I'm not going to pay you. You're not going to pay me. What do you mean? Right? That is where I think that your salesperson needs to be aware of what you're saying, either how much stuff costs, what your average turn cost is, and that should be communicated to them. So then they are prepared whenever they get to this point to know what they need to save, right? What they need to have available for funds to be able to move forward with that.
And it is going to be so much less painful to have that conversation with an owner you kind of hardly know. You're establishing a relationship and you're able to say, hey, we need these funds. This is an expectation to work with us. And then them say, no, I'm not willing to pay that. And you can say, okay, great. I don't think that we're the best company for you.
Yeah.
And you may want to go somewhere else. How much harder is that whenever you are 2 years into a relationship and a residence at the property and the owner doesn't have the financial stamina to be able to complete those emergency repairs?
Exactly.
And now you're sitting there with a resident that's now potentially threatening litigation because work's not being completed or fair housing claims are filed. That all could have been avoided if you would have just weeded that out in the beginning.
And then you're not listed as additionally insured. Like you are just so done at that point.
You're cooked,
Yes. Oh yeah. Cooked. Done. So what I'm hearing is we are not bankrolling any repairs at the property. We need to make sure that we have the funds collected 100% before we are moving forward with any repairs being done at the property.
If you're incredibly uncomfortable getting the full 100 at a minimum 50, do not move forward scheduling any work until you have 50% done. And you better have a really good relationship with that vendor, because if that property takes 2 to 3 months to rent, now that vendor is potentially waiting for payment.
Yeah.
But I do think 100% is going to be the safest option. And it's also going to just be better for your vendors. Your vendors shouldn't have to wait 2 months because it's taking a while to rent a property to get paid.
Absolutely. That's good. And then just to be clear in this, is it the same policy for the 100% upfront, whether we're using outside vendors or in-house maintenance?
I think it should be the same. Yeah, I think regardless that we need the funds to be able to complete the work. And if an owner pushes back and is like, well, you're doing the work, why like you guys have the policy. Yeah, that's the policy. You know, our team also needs to be paid.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that makes total sense. Okay. So we, at this point now, we are doing the work. We've sent in our vendor, or I'm sorry. We have estimates. We've called the owner. We've had the conversation with them. They say, yes, go ahead. We're collecting funds from them. Now are we dispatching vendors to go in and...
And I think that's where this is...
There's lots of hand gestures in this one. And do the
magic, right? This is where we have team members that are communicating, and we have everything lined up in the order it needs to be completed. I mean, we've all been there where, you know, you get the cleaning done just a little bit too early, and then all of a sudden
that's gonna be my question is, what is the order? Like, is there an order that we should schedule vendors in?
Cleaning last.
Are you sure?
Cleaning last.
We don't want to clean and then paint?
I mean, probably
clean
not.
and redo the floors?
Cleaning labs I recommend, you know, but I think that like order of operations is going to be as it needs to be. We have some companies that, you know, they will do the full deep clean, do the other things, and then come and do a final clean. It is all dependent on your vendors and your capacity and your expectations. But I think it is good to track it one way or another and have an idea of when vendors are going out, have some sort of way to manage that. Whether some people have it as a giant whiteboard behind them and they have their turn board, and when people are moving out, people moving in and scheduling vendors, we see that a lot more multifamily. In multifamily, you will be hard pressed not to find some form of turn board because it's almost always in-house maintenance and teams on site who are doing that work. When we're looking at the single family residential end, you're typically contracting, let's say 20-30% have in-house maintenance and have teams that can do really anything that needs to be done. But a lot of people really rely on having that external maintenance. And so you're knowledgeable on how long each thing works. You're communicating very clearly with your vendors on when they have availability, and then scheduling in order of importance, and of course scheduling those final cleanings last, preferably as close as you can to the marketing, so you can make sure that people are having that really great first
Sure.
impression when they walk in the property.
That makes sense. I have a question on that, but I'm going to put a pin in that.
Okay.
Stay focused for just a moment here. So then, do you recommend for a team member or somebody to go walk the property after all of the vendors are done to make sure that it's up to standard? Do you recommend vendors taking pictures and sending them as they go through? What's best practice to ensuring that the work is actually getting done?
I really like boots on the ground, and I know that's not feasible for all teams.
Mm-hmm.
I know some teams really just have to have the vendors. They don't have the capacity to go to every
Sure.
property, but I think boots on the ground is going to solve a lot of problems that we see. One of the pushback we get from a lot of the companies we work with when we're saying we need someone at the property is, well, we don't have time.
Yeah.
So we asked, okay, so how long does it take us to fix the problems? How many hours are we spending on the work orders that are coming in after move-in because we need to go inspect the property? And that number is always higher. So having someone at the property be able to just visually see if there's work that's needed, it's better to do that now than to do that a day before move-in, and all of a sudden you realize the garage is full of a bunch of cleaning supplies that should have been removed.
No, that makes sense. So when and we are not getting into marketing on this episode. I know we're going to talk about marketing on our next episode. Can you, from onboarding, should you start your make ready and marketing at the exact same time? Like, can you be, and maybe this is a question for better for next episode. I don't know, you tell me, but you're saying before we get to the marketing stage, we want to make sure that we're walking through and making sure that everything's done. But can we be marketing while we're in an active make ready?
So it goes one of two ways, and we see it both ways. I think this is a fair question to have here because onboarding, make ready, and marketing are just
so
they
interwoven.
are a braid. They are very
Oh, they are. I was like, what is three things together? It's a braid. It is a braid.
They're a beautiful French braid, if you will. So when you have these three processes running so closely together, there's always going to be a little bit of overlap.
Sure.
You're going to be thinking about your marketing materials at the same time you're completing the work, and you might be scheduling photos the day that the cleaning is completed, right? So there's going to always be a little bit of overlap of these processes. I do really like the companies and the way that they structure it whenever marketing is not beginning until make ready is complete. So we do not market a property until it's move-in ready. I think that saves a lot of pain.
Oh, I think that makes the property rent so much faster.
Oh my god. And you don't lose qualified residents because they want to go see the property tomorrow, or they're in town for a weekend and it's not ready. Right?
Let me tell you, that marketing episode's going to be fire.
Oh, absolutely. And so I think that it's really important to have some form of delineation of when you're going to start the marketing. Some people do. They have the photos already. They're, they'll get them from the owner. They'll go take an exterior shot, and then they're going to list it on the market and say, ready for showing in 2 weeks. Sure, fine. If that's the way you want to do it, you can do it that way. I think there's a lot of value in having some form of kind of pre-marketing.
Sure.
The company I worked for had their own, their very own coming soon page, and it was incredible. So it was a separate thing where they listed the coming soon properties, and then they would go into have the marketing, but they wouldn't be listed live until they were
make ready is complete.
Exactly. But you could still see what was up and get preliminary interest, right? So I think that is an incredible solve for this problem. Not every company has the resources to do that, and I understand that. But I think it's really, if you're going to put it on Zillow, if you're going to put it on, Zumper and all of those other listing websites, I think that they should be able to go in and view that property within 24 hours.
And in a condition that they're going to move into it at.
And almost every listing is going to have the most interest in the first 24 to 48 hours. So imagine
first impressions really matter here.
Exactly. Imagine wasting those 48 hours because you're telling everyone you can't show it yet because it's not ready. So I think that it is it's a little bit short-sighted, and I understand it looks better to the owner when we can say, hey, you've only been with us for a week and your property's already live, but is that really in the best interest of the owner, or are you just trying to save face, right?
Yeah.
If another company is promising that, you can look at the owner and say, yeah, but how many of these are they losing because they're willing to market it so early? And I think, again, that is a preliminary conversation you're having with the owner, and you're making it very clear that these are the expectations and having really good reasons why. If you can say, hey, owner, I know this isn't ideal, but this is why we do it this way. This is why it makes sense. You're not going to lose a deal over that.
Yeah.
And if you do, that's it.
Absolutely. I think that every company has their own unique flair in how they approach this. But I think, in my opinion, I'd love to hear yours as well. The best companies that we have worked with and the fastest growing companies have very, very clear make ready standards, and they are documented and they are so well described to their entire team that saves so many issues, because when one person thinks something's fine and the other person thinks it's not fine, then you just have all this conflict inside of the company. And so making sure that's well documented, I think saves a lot of headaches as you go down the line. But I would say the most successful companies that we've worked within, everybody knew what the make ready standards were.
And we'll talk a lot about this a bit more when we go to our day-to-day management. We're talking about really the customer service aspect.
Right.
I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about unreasonable hospitality at that point. But it's really, really valuable when everyone on your team knows if something needs to be done.
Absolutely.
If an owner is calling and saying, hey, I don't know, should I do this? That the person answering the phone can say, oh yeah, you should do that one. Like that's something that needs to be done. And they don't have to say, oh, let me ask your property manager. They'll get back to you.
Absolutely.
The team should be very well versed on those expectations from top to bottom.
Absolutely. Okay, so to recap here of our property management company is doing the work. We have visited the property. We've determined what needs to be done. We talked to the owner about how much we think it's going to cost. We collect at least 50%, but preferably 100% of the money up front. We do the work. We go back to the property, boots on the ground, make sure everything has been completed. Is that the end of make ready, or are we then letting the owners know, how do we wrap this up, or what steps are we missing?
I think this is where we're going to have a little bit of overlap with our marketing, because we may be at the property, we may be going through taking our marketing photos at that point or meeting a photographer there. I think this is kind of our clean break where we are saying, okay, we're now transitioning firmly to the marketing process. Everything is up to our standards. And now we can make that listing live. And again, once we jump into marketing, we're going to talk about some of that pre-work we may be doing in regards with our make ready process.
Do you think that it is valuable to send the owners an email and say, hey, we're done?
I think you should send an owner every time you do something good. You say, hey, owner, I did something good.
Hey, I did something great. Your property is ready. Congratulations.
Yeah, I did all of your work. It looks so good. You can even have a photo of you at the property, like a selfie, just say, look how clean it is. Like I think there is, unless you are telling the owner in your sales process, the best reason you work with us is because you're never going to hear from us.
Then don't talk to them. Yes.
Nothing wrong with letting them know.
Absolutely. Okay, awesome. So what else, Kandise? What are your, let's wrap this up here with just your best thing, like best practices for make ready. What do people need to make sure that they are doing within their make ready process?
Get the funds up front.
Oh.
Make sure that you have the money for the work that you're going to be completing. Clear expectations. The team should know what's happening. Everyone should know what's going on, and everyone should know what the expectations are. Make the documented item that tells the owner what the expectation is and have them sign off on it. Have that as a resource in case you get pushed back later, and do not make exceptions. One exception is going to break the process, and once you make one, it's really easy to make 10 more.
That was amazing, Kandise. Nothing else to add. What are your closing thoughts?
Don't let your owners do your make readies.
Don't let your owners do your make readies. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of the Path Building Podcast. I am Kristen.
And I'm Kandise.
And we will see y'all on the next podcast.
Bye.